Well, this took longer than expected. Hope the detail makes up for it. In lieu of a recap, just watch the first one again, because I'm probably going to squash these all together once they're done anyway. So what happened with the Eternals after Jack Kirby's brief return to Marvel in the 70s ended with their story basically unfinished, their series cancelled, and fans of Marvel's deep cosmic cosmology finding them fascinating, but everyone else finding them impenetrable? Well, as was the case with the New Gods characters over at DC, they dispersed out into their publisher's broader universe, which in this case meant the core. So what about that whole space gods coming back to judge humanity thing from the no longer extant Eternals comic ultimately got wrapped up in the pages of the Mighty Thor, which was at the time under the long-term stewardship of also then Marvel editor-in-chief Roy Thomas, which means we have to open this f***ing can of worms. Okay, so this is an Eternals episode and not an industry gossip episode, so I'll try and keep this brief. Roy Thomas was probably the forefather of the fanboy-made-good archetype of a comics professional. He was a dude who really loved comic books, was huge into what Marvel was doing in the mid-60s, busted his ass auditioning to get a writing job there, did, and once he got there, effectively became Stan Lee's protege as a comics writing machine, cranking out material, creating stuff, and, as he accrued clout within the company, arguably becoming the first architect, succeeded by Mark Grunwald, of what we now think of as the Marvel Universe in its present form, as a deeply connected web of taken very seriously mythology built off the ideas that the original bullpen were, not taking very seriously at all, and making up as fast as they could week to week. He's responsible for a bunch of your favorite Marvel stories, characters. He also wrote a ton of memorable stuff for DC and other companies. He created Red Sonja, also a bunch of cartoon and film writing. It's pretty much widely accepted that his early gambit that Marvel should grab the comic license for a movie project that he'd heard good things about called Star Wars saved Marvel's bacon as a company in the 70s, so, flat circle and all that. Basically, if there was one time in history where let's actually hire one of these super huge convention-goer, letter-writer fanfic dudes to work for us and tell us since they know what that crowd wants was actually going to pay off, Roy Thomas was the super nerd you'd want it to happen around. It basically worked out. But there's also been always kind of this thing in the ether of the industry about this period of time as to whether or not he and Jack Kirby had some kind of mutual chip on their shoulders at each other because Thomas was the rising star through the ranks as the ultimate team player at Marvel in the same period. Kirby was feeling like he needed more credit and breathing room. Not for nothing is the greedy huckster businessman villain in the New Gods, Funky Flashman, a widely regarded caricature of Stan Lee, assisted by a toadying sidekick named, House Roy. So obviously, Thomas being the one who got to direct to the close the door but open a window future on Kirby's Eternals has always had a touch of, well, that's interesting, hovering over it, but it doesn't really show up in the books that I can see, and I'm not prone to business gossip here, but if you wanted me to bring it up, there, I brought it up. Anyway, in an even by 70s Marvel standards batshit crazy storyline that ran from Thor Annual number 7 in 1978 to Thor number 301 in 1980, Thor finds out that his memory has been erased a bunch of times, specifically because he met the Eternals before during his own couple hundreds of thousands of years of life, and stuff happened that he's gonna have to have forgotten for this plot to make any kind of sense. Also, he doesn't know who his birth mother is, which was a plot point at this time in the comics, which was even stranger about that stuff than the movies are, and anyway, all this happens because Arishem, ostensibly the field leader of the Celestials, since this is gonna be long and or two parts anyway, the Celestials generally include the One Above All, Ziran the Tester, Arishem the Judge, Gruffon the Regurger, Jemiah the Analyzer, Gamenon the Gatherer, Exitar the Exterminator, Nezar the Calculator, Turfal the Surveyor, Eson the Searcher, Hargan the Measurer, Oneg the Prober, Eshem the Listener, Devron the Experimenter, Gamiel the Manipulator, Ea the Wise.
Well, if you wanted to make Serac the Preparer cry, mission accomplished.
The Blue One, the Red One. Nope, for real, these two are just called the Red Celestial and the Blue Celestial, don't even ask. The Red and Blue One, which has never really been fully explained. The Celestial Gardeners, which are sort of what they sound like, and also connected to Apocalypse from X-Men, really. Some of them also turn unambiguously evil at a certain point and are the Dark Celestials, which has to do with really older ones called the Progenitor and Zegreb the Aspirant, aka Zegreb the Sorrower. We're gonna circle back to that. Oh, and also the Celestial Madonna, who is both her own thing and also Mantis. Yes, that Mantis. Or they just share the title, or there's some time and relative dimension stuff happening. It's always been a little unclear. Oh, Christ, I'm gonna have to explain that too.
He is in anguish. He mourns.
And Tiamat the Dreaming Celestial, who is underground on Earth and having himself a nap. Must be nice. So anyway, Arishem the Judge decides that now is as good a time as any to begin the judgment process of all life on Earth, which is going to take about 50 years. Wait, these are comics from the mid-70s to the early 80s, generally keeping a contemporary timeline carry the one. Oh wow, right about now, pretty soon. That's kind of funny, huh? So Thor goes on walkabout because he finds this upsetting with a bunch of other Asgardian drama that this was going on in the series at the time, and he meets up with the Eternals, fights some deviants, also some luchadors in Mexico for some reason, helps the Eternals, who've decided they aren't down with Arishem's judginess no more, to lead a Unimind attack on the space gods, but plot twist, Odin shows up and tells him,
"Son, just don't."
At which point the whole thing kind of ceases to have much to do with the Eternals and instead becomes some of the most Roy Thomas-ish stuff ever published as the story flashes back into an extended retcon of the ancient history of the Marvel timeline in the form of a now Thor-adjacent version of the Siegfried saga, the whole thing. Odin and the Asgardians teaming up with the Greek, Egyptian, Aztec, Mayan, Celtic, Hindu, Shinto, just all the other pantheons of polytheistic gods who, yes, are thus also implied to be advanced cosmic alien beings humans just thought of as gods like Thor and Odin, so probably not seeing this in the movies, to battle the Celestials back in ancient times and getting just their asses handed to them and told not to try that ever again. So back in the present, Odin tries that again, but the entire situation gets resolved instead by the intervention of Gaia, as in the goddess of Earth itself, Mother Earth if you like, character who also exists in the Marvel Universe, and a team of characters called the Young Gods who, nope, not explaining that, nobody cares about the Young Gods except I guess the Celestials who take Gaia's word for it that they represent human excellence well enough that they can call off the judgment thing for another however long, and that's kinda that. See you next Armageddon.
It's an ending, that's enough.
Oh, and Gaia is Thor's biological mother, it turns out, so put a bow on that plot point as well. For now. Yeah, with that settled, the Eternals, mostly dispersed throughout the Marvel Universe as cameo characters for whenever the Celestials or other big origin stuff parts of their mythos were getting roped in to give more cohesion to the rest of the continuity. So remember that business about the Inhumans also being created by the Kree doing experiments on early humans? Well, it soon got retconned that the Kree and the Skrulls and their respective messed up individual histories and their whole ancient war with one another was all based around the Celestials messing with their societies in the ancient past, and their experiments on the Inhumans were an attempt to create anti-celestial weaponry. Sure. There were also variants of the Eternals created on other planets as well, now retroactively including Planet Titan and the Titanian Eternals, meaning yes, Thanos is an Eternal. But wait, you're asking, what about that whole the Eternals are pretty and the deviants look like monsters thing? Well, it doesn't always work out that way because recessive genes, so sometimes Eternals look like deviants, and that's what happened with Thanos, i.e. the chin stuff, and it made the other kids on Titan pick on him when he was little, and that's the initial reason why he's such a dick. Really. But for the most part, other than some ill-advised, short-lived relaunches and revamps and attempts at a proper series, the main comics people were reading showcase for the Eternals-related action in the Marvel Universe of the 80s and 90s came mainly via Cersei joining the Avengers and being the extremely chaotic love interest of Dane Whitman, the Black Knight, the guy Kit Harington is playing in the movie, remember. They had adventures, they had love triangles, they had very unfortunate costume designs a lot of the time, he had red eyes at one point. These aren't exactly remembered as the best eras of the Avengers books, but you should keep in mind that until the turn of the millennium, the general concept of the Avengers as a team was less Marvel's Justice League and more Tony Stark's tax write-off halfway house and or crash pad for superheroes between steady gigs, sometimes also featuring Captain America and Thor. In any case, as mentioned last episode, story events contrived for Cersei and Renaissance fair Punisher here to become joined in telepathic Eternals brain marriage, which became a useful handwave to send both of them time-traveling and into alternate universes during the 90s era of a million crossover events, possibly the most infamous but most potentially significant of which surrounded Marvel's purchase of rival Malibu Comics under their ULTRAVERSE line of superhero books, which in turn came with its own in-house answer to the Avengers' Ultra You want me to play the rest of that, huh? Okay. So I should probably do a separate show sometime down the line about Malibu and what did or did not go down in this whole deal because complicated, but the relevant stuff is that Black Knight and Cersei both wound up in the Ultraverse as part of the lead-up to the crossover event Black September that was meant to end the original Ultraverse and relaunch it with a revamped Marvel integrated continuity. The eventually revealed story involved another new, further back origin and for time, the universe, and everything. Don't worry, I've stopped counting too.
First time.
In which we learned that the universe itself was born of the apparent original cosmic mother of all creation, Nemesis, committing suicide because she was lonely and thus broke her energies and psyche into, you guessed it, the Infinity Stones.
There were 6 singularities. Then the universe exploded into existence, and the remnants of these systems were forged into concentrated ingots.
Infinity Stones?
We actually got a lot of those. Some of the guys use them as paperweights.
But, whereas previously we'd always heard there were 6 stones, space, mind, soul, reality, time, and power, it turns out there's a 7th that's been in the Ultraverse this whole time, the Ego Stone, which actually contains Nemesis at this point very villainous personality, possesses Cersei and uses her in turn to use Loki and the Grandmaster to make the Avengers and Ultraforce, which Black Knight had at this point joined, fight each other in a way too complicated scheme to reunite all of the stones in order to make Nemesis whole again so she could rule and or destroy the universe, and anyway, Black Knight defeats her because he has a magic sword and Marvel was really giving him the push at the time. Hard to believe they aren't plastering bookshelves with this one so everyone can get caught up for Kit Harington's brand new MCU role, right?
Comet Castle falls. Samson Cyberblood is the new king of the star system. Long live Space Shire 7 and long live the hyperspeed throne.
Anyway, this was 1995 and it took about a decade of other false starts before Marvel decided, hey, what if the Eternals were good? And then opted to be realistic and shoot for, or at least interesting, and let Neil Gaiman take a shot at it alongside John Romita Jr. on art duties in 2006 with a reboot that, actually it's pretty good. Little similar to several other Marvel series at the time, most notably Thor and other takes on similar properties in his own work, but yeah, the main thrust of Gaiman's Eternals is giving the entire property a soft reboot, opening with the main cast of Kirby's original series having been wandering the Earth for a certain amount of time with their memories erased thinking they're regular humans, and needing to be reawakened in order to talk the Celestials out of another human's bad judgment call. With that jumping off point, the storyline ramps up and updates the personas of the main cast and introduces some further nuance into their general situation, along with some dark revelations about the reasons for the deviants' rejections of the Celestials' authority, cool new visualizations of the Celestials themselves, including the book's iconic image of the awakened Tiamat, the dreaming guy, remember, looming over San Francisco, and a heel turn by Permachild Sprite, driven mad by being trapped in a pre-adult body this whole time. But the biggest change was to the Eternals themselves, who discover they're actually more like cosmic machines than living organisms, and they don't actually have free will. They are programmed to behave how the Celestials want up to a point, and they shut down if they actually exceed that programming or try to stop them. Bummer. Fights were had, characters lived and died, came back to life, took different forms, changed sides, since we now know death is even less consequential for the Eternals than almost everyone else in the genre, and you'll be shocked to learn that an Eternal series was once again met with critical acclaim and respectful puzzlement by many, many others. It is pretty interesting either way. And Gaiman's 7-issue series performed well enough that Marvel elected to try and keep the franchise going as an ongoing series after that under Charles and Daniel Knauf. It turns out there's an only destroy stuff evil space locust swarm counterpart to the Celestials called the Horde, and they both actually serve an all-powerful being called the Fulcrum, who is definitely not just
the actual god,
who looks like Jack Kirby, this being the 3rd or 4th time Marvel has depicted
definitely not the actual god,
looking like Jack Kirby.
When you do things right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all.
And it turns out by this point we are well into these superheroes are huge money-making machines everywhere but the Dead Tree publishing era, in which Marvel in particular soon after established itself as the biggest player in the game through the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the marketing, storyline, and audience engagement crux of which was its shared continuity, which meant that all of this Eternals, Celestials, conveniently unified origin for all the weird stuff backstory material got to hang around and be very important as the publishing side of the company became more and more actively a test kitchen for future MCU goings-on, i.e. the managing of the timeline and everyone getting their spit and polish, let's all get woke to what we've calculated may or may not fly in our dying niche industry of sad man-child dungeons, but will likely succeed in the rest of the world, makeovers. And so the Celestials did it, and the Eternals either did too much or not enough about it, became either part or whole of the background noise to a succession of huge cosmic stories, involving in no particular order a war between the Celestials and the Watchers, a war between the Celestials and the Beyonders, another civil war, the revelation, subsequent destruction and reformations of several different multiverses, several different versions of the X-Men existing in the same timeline at once, the Celestials being destroyed and reborn a few times, presents all of this again as the background of stories with more specific aims like squashing the Marvel and Ultimate Marvel universes into one thing, can we use old Wolverine again, etc. And eventually, the Eternals and Celestials found themselves at the center of the new Volume 8 #1 relaunch of the Avengers monthly series under Jason Aaron and Ed McGuinness in 2018, which promised a battle against the final Celestial host, and for reals this time, yo, the real ultimate explanation of where all the Marvel stuff comes from, dialing the in the beginning flashback clock back to before, the previous before, and who even knows if the Nemesis before from Black September still counts, to reveal that what's really been going on is that while the Celestials and the Horde are supposed to use their planetary evolution experiments to compete over whether the Eternals or Deviants win, and who gets to absorb the planet's life energy when Fulcrum says enough is enough, the Horde are assholes and sometimes just eat the Celestials themselves, which either kills them or turns them into Dark Celestials. At one point in the distant past, an attack by the Horde caused the mortally wounded Celestial progenitor's corpse to fall on the still infant planet Earth and bleed out all over the surface, thus explaining why Earth is such a hotbed for mutants and superhumans and magicians and all the other Marvel Universe things, even before the other Celestials started up and doing Eternals stuff. Which, okay, you might say that actually make things a little simpler, actually, at least more streamlined. Of course there's more. See, Progenitor's fellow Celestial Zegreb the Aspirant comes looking for the body billions of years later during Earth's Stone Age, gets infected by the Horde themselves, and becomes Zegreb the Sorrower, who starts wrecking up the place and is only defeated by, retcon of all retcons, the prehistoric first Avengers. Oh, come on! A for some reason previously unmentioned team-up of Odin, the first Phoenix, the first Black Panther, Agamotto, the first Sorcerer Supreme, the first Iron Fist, Caveman Starbrand, you, I am not explaining what the Starbrand is here, and Ghost Rider on a woolly mammoth. Okay, so this is kind of dumb, but also kind of awesome, right? Like, why didn't someone think to put all the ancient versions of guys on one team before this? It also turns out Gaia wasn't Thor's real mom, the first Phoenix was. Just go with that one for now. Anyway, in the present, the most recent iteration of modern-day Avengers ends up dealing with Zegreb busting out of the underground prison their Caveman Days predecessors stuck him in, and a whole mess of Dark Celestials are coming to destroy the Earth. Somehow it's Loki's fault, so... Avengers!
Assemble.
Yeah, the newest reveal for this round is that the Celestials never intended Earth's Eternals to protect humanity. They were really trying to create a biomass energy source they could cultivate, so global genocide either way, as antibodies to vaccinate themselves against the Horde. The Eternals, having finally had enough of this bullshit, commit a mass suicide to take themselves out of the whole equation for good, which, you know, I don't not get it, having had to read back through all of this.
Done!
But not before bequeathing the ability to use the Unimind to the Avengers so that they can, like, really assemble now. Oh, and then the Eternals themselves came back to life again like 6 months ago in a new ongoing series from Kieran Gillen and Esad Ribic that actually shows a lot of promise, so hooray. So yeah, that's the Eternals and their whole mess up to this point.
I can't f***ing do this anymore!
Trust me, it would have been worse if I hadn't kind of breezed past how it's wrapped up in the time travel X-Men stuff, but I didn't feel like doing a bunch of Joss Whedon qualifiers and dealing with how Myra McTaggart is supposed to fit into all of this, or not. Hell, most of this would have fallen under look it up yourselves. But since I'm an episode ahead of most people on Loki, and it's now a semi-regular gig to try and figure out how this multiversal business might play out, I've kind of got a feeling some of this might actually be relevant sooner or later.
What does that mean? Is it bad?
So, now that you know what there is to know about the utter nonsense behind the Eternals, give me, hopefully, a little less time than this second part took, and I'll be back for a primer on where all the little tangents of this might actually pay off. I'm Bob, and shit, I still have to explain the f***ing Celestial Madonna thing, don't I? Okay. So, the Celestial Madonna refers to two characters created separately from one another in distinct storylines many decades apart, one of whom hasn't proved all that important in the recurring sense, but who is part of the Celestials as proper noun Eternals mythos, and the other of whom is a fairly important recurring Marvel fixture, particularly in the MCU era, who is not part of the Eternals business so far. In fact, her whole thing actually came first, believe it or not, but they're both wrapped up in each other's stuff tangentially because of how the Kirby Eternals stuff has been used to connect everything supposedly more cohesively cohesively. And they're kinda wishy-washy on what the name similarity means or doesn't mean, other than, celestial just being a real word that means up in the sky. So, yeah. So the first one is part of the Eternals celestial stuff, though a later addition to the mythology. She's never really manifested as important other than being the lead-off story focus of a solo S.H.I.E.L.D. series that retconned the agency as having existed across history. It includes members like Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, Newton, you get the picture.
Demons, omens, codes, monks. Da Vinci.
Where she gave birth to another celestial called Starchild, and also she has this whole laying an evil egg in the earth thing, which if I was compressing all the Eternal stuff into a movie, that's something I'd use in place of the other more confusing things, just a thought, but otherwise not actually that hugely important of a celestial character, all things considered. The Celestial Madonna saga, on the other hand, is a 1974 Avengers storyline from Roy Thomas and Steve Englehart, who, by the way, is also one of the main guys behind the creation of Shang-Chi, the Vision and Scarlet Witch miniseries, Secret Empire, aka the first big Captain America versus domestic politics storyline in modernity, and the 50s anti-communist Cap was a different evil guy story. So, like, a lot of the kickoff for Phase 4 has felt like a man Kevin Feige must really be a big Steve Englehart fan reveal. But yeah, he also wrote this along with Thomas, and it's a big sprawling Avengers story that was about as spacey as Marvel was getting at that point, until Kirby and Starling got going on their respective stuff a couple years later, at which point all of this would be running concurrently, but not really crisscrossing until all that nonsense with Thor I just got done explaining. Short version, the original comics version of Mantis started out as a way different character from the movies. She was a Vietnamese woman martial artist who was at one point the love interest of villain-turned-hero the Swordsman, who was kind of like Hawkeye but for stabbing, and he was dead at this point, and his body was inhabited by the ghost of an alien tree, no relation, from a psychic space tree race called the Kotati, and yes, the name and the faux Native American mall kiosk spiritualism vibe you're getting from the whole thoughtful magic tree spirit thing are indeed as cringy as you're imagining.
In your face, Space Coyote!
Space Coyote?
Who believes that Mantis is the Celestial Madonna, who, if she chooses to conceive a child with one of their race, while it assumes Swordsman's form, will give birth to the Celestial Messiah, which, because this is several years before Kirby wrote the Eternals, doesn't have anything to do with those Celestials. This is just gonna be another magical space person.
I'm not the Messiah! I say you are, Lord, and I should know I followed a few!
So she does, and since this is yet another Avengers book with a weird magical pregnancy romance that ends with weird consent issues, and it also tried to tie up the Skrull and Kree stuff neatly before the post-Eternal stuff did, Marvel has had to go and try to retcon and rewrite this one a ton of times, most recently in the event series Empire. The kid's name is Sequoia. He's a plant guy. He's not fond of people who are not plant guys. It's a whole thing. I don't see a ton of indication that's going to come up at any point. Who knows, though? But the Celestial Madonna saga itself was the big sweep of Avengers narrative, where Mantis first became strongly associated with cosmic space stuff, which is how she ended up as a Guardians character in the first place for the movies. It introduced Drax the Destroyer's daughter, Moondragon. It was where Vision's backstory was expanded to include his mechanical body, having been built from the remains of the original cyborg Human Torch from World War II. It's where he and Scarlet Witch were officially married, and where Agatha Harkness was officialized as Wanda's mentor, making her a full witch along with a mutant, which means it led directly into the comic that became WandaVision, so I bet, some of this is relevant. Okay, alright, I think now we can do I'm Bob, and that was exhausting.